All right, almost there. And I'll start with attendance first, just to do a check-in and see who's here. Okay, Mr. Mitchell, would you like to call our meeting to order?
Thank you. Appreciate everybody getting together this afternoon and for Vaughn to provide this presentation. Marissa, I'll let you go ahead and do the roll call. Thank you very much. And do appreciate everybody taking their time to listen in on this valuable information.
Okay. Ms. Shakia Guest. Okay, I think Ms. Guest is on, but she's on mute. Dr. Lynn Aniti.
Present.
Sybil Talley.
Present.
Dr. John Herring.
Present.
Chairman Charles Storm Mitchell.
Present.
Carmen Hollowell Ferguson. Miss Elizabeth T. Miller. Okay, and I think we're ready to go.
All right, Miss Marissa, are you ready for me?
Yes, we're ready.
All right, great. And if they don't mind, if everyone could mute their phones, it looks like most everybody has. It'll just be easier, I think, in these kind of formats. I'll go ahead and do a presentation, and then we'll open up to questions at the end. This won't be a long presentation, and I can certainly go back and forth between slides as you have questions. So just as a little bit of a background, my name is Andrew Core. I'm a landscape architect and historic preservation specialist by training. I have degrees in both. I'm the project manager with Pond and Company. We were hired by both the city of South Fulton and the city of Chattahoochee Hills to look and investigate, develop a master plan for the historic Campbelton Crossroads area that many of you are familiar with, being both a gateway to Douglas County, a gateway into Fulton County, an area with a lot of rich history, an area that people are certainly concerned about growth in the long term as well as preservation. So while it's a very small area in size, it's a very complex area, and there are a lot of issues that we are working through. As part of this project, one of the things we wanted to do is to, and I think that Storm, you made this recommendation, is to kind of present, specifically talk to each of the different preservation commissions in the respective communities, just to give them a heads up. And I know that you all are very new. I know that the commission that you formed is relatively new. As a little bit of background, I am a current member of the Atlanta Urban Design Commission. And I've been on there for 7 years. So I currently sit where you sit as well. And so thank you for your time and your energy and your passion for the history of the South Fulton area. What we're going to do today is, obviously, historic Campbelton is a very complex issue. What I want to do is really talk about historic Campbelton from a historic preservation perspective. And then we have several strategies that we have developed that I'm going to share with you as it relates to historic preservation, and would certainly love your feedback on that. We're going to speak a little bit about urban form, a little bit about the history of the area, and then we'll delve into the actual principles for historic preservation. They're very high level, but I think provide a framework for each of the respective communities to move forward and collaborate together. So For those, I think many of you are familiar with the master plan process, but we are in the middle of that master plan process. And by the way, I do want to, before I begin any further, I forgot to mention Aubrey Saba with Pond, who is really kind of my right-hand woman on this, is on the call as well. So she and I will both be answering questions at the end. But as part of this process, we're right in the middle of it. And a couple of weeks ago, we spent about 2 weeks, spent a week during a hands-on workshop, a very intensive workshop, where we looked at a number of different issues as it relates to historic Campbelton, everything from urban form to historic preservation to transportation to zoning and land use. So we covered a wide variety of topics. As part of that process, we developed these design principles. These design principles that you see are really the guiding force behind the master plan. They are in draft form, but they represent feedback we've heard from the community, represent what we've seen from a design team and planning team's perspective about the area, and what we've heard from talking to individual stakeholders. So I want to show these to you because it provides a context where we are in the current process, but also how we're thinking about historic Campbelton. And you'll notice there are several of these that are very closely related to historic preservation and history. Particularly the second one, we talk about the rural character of Campbelton. This is something that people have talked about a lot. We recognize that historic Campbelton is really could be a precedent for how you think about a number of these other different crossroads communities that were either associated with the railroad, the river, or major turnpikes. So they're very important. There's a number of them in both communities throughout the South Fulton area. We also, as you see there on the third bullet point, we want to celebrate and honor the history of the area. That's so certainly directly applicable to the group we're speaking to today. What we'll say about that, and you'll see in the recommendations, is that this is not just preservation in the bricks and mortar sense of a building. It's also about preservation and the oral histories and the hidden histories of people who often were not documented, or the stories were not documented, or maybe there's not a lot of lasting presence there, but they're still just as valuable. Those kind of lost or hidden histories are very important to document. When we talk about the third one right there, or the fourth bullet point, create a cohesive and vibrant hamlet full of character and charm, that also directly relates to the history of the area. So we want to be respectful of the historic legacy of Campbelton and the surrounding area, and honor how the new growth and development could occur over time. So this gives you a real high-level snapshot about the context and how we're thinking about making decisions as we move forward. And as I mentioned, these are a draft that will eventually be codified in the final plan. So just as some, because you guys are the Historic Preservation Commission, or Historic Commission, we love history, and I do too, so I always love showing these historic maps. This is from a map from 1850, obviously prior to the Civil War, where you have a number of different smaller communities. Here's the Campbelton area. And actually, the area in red that I'm showing is actually the study area. I'm going to actually use a laser pointer there. So you can see this with my laser pointer, this area throughout here, along here. And you have a number of different communities that kind of developed over time. If you dig into detail and looking at these other different elements here, there's really if you blow up on the screen, you'll be able to see the names of different families who lived around here. And that these mills and different townships really became the centerpiece of the community over time. Obviously oriented towards the river, and there was a very logical crossing at the ferry near historic Campbelton. This is another image on the screen. I'm going to minimize that so you guys can see, of the historic Campbelton area. These are land lots of old Campbell County. Again, here's this project area. Here's Campbelton right here. And you have a number of different older communities. Here's the Douglas-Fulton line with the Chattahoochee River. But things like Antioch and Mount Vernon, you'll drive by there today, they're still present. especially with the relative to churches. You have the railroad here, the Palmetto area here. So right there, you can see that little, if you zoom in, you'll be able to see that little area, a block representing a small community of Campbelton. It's still somewhat thriving, but we know that, especially after the Civil War, Campbelton and the area around really remained largely rural, and the people who lived in Campbelton, we know, moved, at least some of them moved, both their homes and their families to nearby Fairburn, where the railroad was. So I love this map. This is one of my favorite maps. What you're looking at is actually the project study area, which is this boundary I'm following all the way around. Here's the Chattahoochee River. Here's Campbelton Fairburn Road. This Cascade Palmetto Highway kind of forms the center. This area in red is the historic grid that was originally the town layout. Obviously, things have changed over time. When they built the road, rebuilt the road in the 60s, they obviously, redesigned this road, Fairburn Campbelton, and kind of almost built a bypass around it, curving it. Up until that time, there was a ferry crossing where my laser pointer is. That ferry crossing was active until the early 1960s for cars and people to get across the Chattahoochee River. There are some historic, you can see some of the historic churches are still there. And if you go to the next slide, you'll be able to see some of these historic, some of this historic imagery. Everything from a number of different, four different cemeteries, and even Friendship Baptist Cemetery. And then, in fact, we know from talking to people that there was actually a former building. It was an AME church, had a cinder block building here, and early 20th century building here. And in fact, there's a cemetery that goes beyond these boundaries that you see on here, that I believe to be an African American cemetery, sits beyond the boundaries here onto this person's property. You can actually find remnants of that cemetery there. The old Masonic Lodge. You have the 1936 monument that was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps here in the 30s. You have the approximate ferry crossing. In fact, there was a former school. This is the Campbelton Academy, built around 1829. It was demolished. This sits on the remnants of that supposedly are there today. This is the Carl Buchart property. For those of you familiar with that, this property, he owns about 8,000 acres, known as Buchart Farms. If you look on Google Maps, you will find that. And then this kind of is the boundary. Essentially, you can see the dash line. And more or less, these are the boundaries of city of South Fulton, Chattahoochee Hills. So as you can see on the previous map, historic Campbelton bled to some degree into South Fulton, but primarily was on the city of Chattahoochee Hills side of the property. As part of this project, we have developed a timeline. The timeline is a working timeline, and it's meant to begin a discussion about thinking about there's other parts of this history of the community that we don't have documented. So it's really taking the available information we have and begin putting it on a timeline to kind of illustrate the value and importance of the area, ranging from the early 1750 all the way up to 2000, really modern present era timeline. This is a work in progress, as always. As we have more data, people provide us more input, we will add it on here. But you can see documenting everything from potentially when when the church was built, moved to its current location, all the way to when they built the marker here, or when they began looking at preservation and preserving the area along the river. So a lot of different things have happened over the time period. Again, there's a lot of unwritten history here. They're hoping this project is really the start of a conversation that will warrant some interest in documenting unwritten history. So one thing I want to talk about briefly that we've been working on is the idea of urban form. And when we talk about urban form, we talk about everything, different ideas about building form. We talk about areas related to setbacks, even street design guidelines, thinking about these different areas. And as part of this urban form exercise that we went through, we looked and kind of broke the Campbelton study area into different areas. We began looking at areas that are suitable for development. So these areas that you see in yellow, we said, okay, you know, this area here is the area that is the historic core of Campbelton. Areas in yellow, and then areas in green are less suitable and either in floodplain locations or in areas that are deemed by MERPA, which is the Metropolitan Regional Protection Act, and their 2,000-foot buffer along the Chattahoochee River, deem certain areas less desirable than others to develop. So we begin looking at how can we be smart about planning out any future development in historic Campbelton. And sorry for the misspelling. I thought I fixed that. But this is really just kind of a work in progress document. What you can see is we develop different character areas. And the idea of character areas is so you can really drill down deeper and be looking at very specific parts of a larger study area, and then make recommendations and make decisions that are much more closely associated with these relative study areas. And again, this focus of this presentation is on the preservation, but I want to show this, that, you know, here's this historic core area. And if we will thinking about development or in and around this intersection, it makes sense to make sure that these different areas speak to one another from a preservation and, let's say, architecture and building form perspective. There's areas out here. This is the Buchart property. As he mentioned, it's 8,000 acres, and he's talking a lot about designing and looking at large planned community, mixed use in a variety of different housing types. You know, if we introduce smaller acreage lots in here, then maybe really transition out, as many people desire, to maintain a much more rural atmosphere and maintain that lifestyle. So these areas along the river that are very much focused on preserving and conserving existing open space, existing history, and obviously there's already a park space here, accentuating and highlighting this park and these beautiful overlooks that exist in and around the river. So that's how we're putting our kind of master planning hats on with thinking about historic preservation, and then begin thinking about areas where we can look at little development nodes, commercial nodes, potentially small scale areas. We can provide goods and services for the nearby community, restaurants, you know, maybe even a grocery store, things of those uses, and then expanding out to look at more traditional hamlet-style residential along here and transitioning to rural residential. So there's some areas in here we're still looking at. This is very bubbly, very high level, but trying to think about all these different key areas. And one thing I'll mention too, as I mentioned before, this is a gateway into Fulton County as well as into Douglas. And so these really key areas, these areas as you enter the county and enter the area are really important as how we use placemaking and how we tell the story of historic Campbelton, both from maybe its art, its placemaking, its history, making sure people are very aware about those areas. So these bubbles just represent areas that are of importance. You might want to think about that. Again, very high level. And as I mentioned, especially as it relates to historic preservation, we can take visual cues from actually the city of Fairburn. We know that in the 1870s, a lot of residents from Campbelton moved to Fairburn, especially in and around the old Campbell County Courthouse, which you see here on the left. This Campbell County Courthouse is a very close, bears very close resemblance to the original courthouse built there at historic Campbelton over the years. And in areas around the courthouse, you'll see these stone walls here and these ugly rock walls. Well, these are the very same elements that you see in and around historic Campbelton. You'll see similar stone walls, rock walls. There's historic buildings in and around the historic Campbell County Courthouse that were actually moved from the area to Fairburn to be built around this area after the Civil War. So we can begin looking at some of those historic precedents and understand, take some visual cues from that. We began looking at making sure that, when we talk about mixed use and any type of new redevelopment, that has some historic elements like Sonoy here, downtown Lilburn, or this is some infill development that's very new, but making sure it responds as complementary, but not exactly replicable of the historic footprints and historic architecture that was there. We talked about the community hamlet feel, these small areas of maybe a mix of restaurants or housing or community facilities. These are areas here that we think are really applicable in terms of, these just kind of represent potential architectural styles that could be complementary of that kind of rural architecture, and be something that's more modern, but something that still is new and fresh and distinguishes itself from the remaining remnants of historic Campbelton. There's ideas about areas along the river and capturing views on the river, and there's potential for maybe even an event facility or something to really capture that. We know that Chattahoochee Hills is actually opening a boat launch in their park along the Chattahoochee River in the fall, and that's going to bring a lot of popularity to the area. So we want to be smart in how we capture and make sure we tell the story well about Campbelton as people visit. Different ideas about residential uses. I mean, these are just pictures I've used to illustrate this is not what has to be built there, but the idea that the point of this is you have traditional building forms, front gable roofs, front porches, 2-over-2 windows, these things, doors with transoms that are used in traditional settings that you can add some modern flares and really make it fit in well. This is kind of more the new, on the bottom left, the new formal country farmhouse look, so to speak, that is very popular right now. But again, kind of a traditional look that takes on a slightly modern twist. And as we talked about rural residential in these larger areas, there may be opportunities to larger kind of 6 to 8 acre tracts of land, maybe have larger houses on there to really expand the breadth of housing types and who can live there. But again, that's all very high level, and I think many years down the road, but we want to kind of begin planting the seed of what it could be. And it doesn't have to be this, but the idea of what is very, very traditional looks in terms of kind of rural architecture with modern amenities. So apologies. So we began looking at historic preservation specifically, and there are a couple issues that arise. One is that there are no locally designated properties that are protected in either city. So both communities have national registered properties, either in district or individual landmark form, that have been documented, but those designations do not protect the properties at all. You really need local designation to protect the properties. And so hence the role of historic preservation commissions throughout the state of Georgia. That's really their role, to review and propose, and approve changes to historically designated properties. So obviously, I understand in your situation, your commission is fairly new. And in the Chattahoochee Hills situation, they only make recommendations to the city council, but generally this is not done. So they're really looking more at a, encouraging or persuading, making the city council to make good decisions, but they don't have any authority or any that helps bind decisions made by the council. So as part of that, we began looking at different strategies. And so what I wanted to show you here for a moment is talking about different strategies we think are appropriate for historic preservation as it relates to Campbelton Crossroads. The first strategy is one I mentioned at the beginning, which is one that focuses on how that you need to develop alternative ways to tell the story of the Campbelton Crossroads area with special consideration for hidden stories as it pertains to the Native American, African American histories. These are often largely not documented. These are often largely, many people know these stories, but they've been written down over time. And often, sometimes people are unwilling to share these stories. So it's really, when you talk about oral histories and capturing these stories, it really does take years of trust to build up and really help build a network of people who have a background in collecting oral history and show the willingness to capture those stories, because sometimes they're painful, sometimes they're hidden, sometimes people are unwilling to share, sometimes they've been forgotten. And so oral histories are really important, but also telling those stories in creative ways. That goes to strategy number 2, which is much of the history is unwritten, and collecting oral histories is needed. So it's really kind of a build off of number 1, which is, collecting oral histories is very important. I will tell you that you have a very good resource in your community, an Allison Duncan, who actually chairs the Historic Commission for Chattahoochee Hills as a Douglas County resident. Allison is very actively involved in collecting oral histories, has a historic preservation background, and previously worked at the Atlanta Regional Commission and has done that type of work before. So she certainly is a local resource and really knows the history well. As someone, I think, as you move forward and you maybe choose to pursue some of these strategies, is someone you can really use as a resource. Strategy 3 is about aligning wayfinding and signage with technology to combine history and tourism. We talked a lot about how there's a number of different applications, phone apps today that you can plug into, especially at kind of larger national databases for people traveling, let's say, through the area, and they want to see, they want to learn about the history of the area. They're just driving through on a road trip. They can kind of plug into various apps and say, oh, hey, here's a story of historic Campbelton, or maybe here's the story of a particular church or a community that's no longer existing, and they can hear about them and visit those places. There's also opportunities to use wayfinding and signage, especially as this area potentially develops more over time, to really make sure all the stories are told about that. But it's really important in over time too, capturing technology and using technology as an asset, not just for wayfinding, but to actually capture stories online, digitally, oral histories and things of that nature to really make it more robust. You also have a scenic, the South Fulton Scenic Parkway area, and that entire area down there is really well traveled by a number of different local residents and visitors alike. There's history throughout this entire South Fulton area. So linking all these stories together is really, I think, a valuable approach and really can bring a lot of good attention to this area. Strategy 4 is to develop a formal approach to maintaining the original courthouse square. The original courthouse square, right today, is really, there's only a monument there where the original courthouse sat. That monument really only focuses on a reunion of Confederate soldiers. It does document the original location of the courthouse, but probably doesn't tell the full story of the history of historic Campbelton. So I think there needs to be an approach of how you preserve that area. You maintain, we've talked about this with Chattahoochee Hills, that it's maintained well. That becomes a centerpiece of the community, to think about that as well. And that's really more focused on the Chattahoochee Hills side, but something to keep in mind. Strategy 5 is also a strategy as it relates to specifically the Chattahoochee Hills, but the Beaver's House really dates to the original time period, and there needs to be a strategy to restore and stabilize the building. The building has a lot of additions over time. The city of Chattahoochee Hills doesn't really have the resources and funds currently to do a full rehabilitation or restoration to a particular time period. And so right now, really, it does have a lot of close affiliation with the area. It needs to be preserved, but there needs to be a creative preservation approach to do it. And also as public property. That's important to consider. And strategy 6 is a way to transform the Reformed Methodist Church building, which sits there right at the border of Chattahoochee Hills and South Fulton, into a community theater and event civic space to ensure its preservation. This came out of a conversation with a number of different people who we've talked to about this area. That area I have a little bit of concern about because it is owned by a property owner who generally doesn't do historic preservation. It's owned by the gas station, the gentleman who owns the gas station there, the Texaco, and it owns the other corner of the property. He has no plans to do anything with the Methodist Church, but it is a landmark. It's where people meet on Saturdays to go biking. It's a logical place to do a farmer's market if you wanted to have pop-up, food trucks. It could very much be a community theater or an event space. I actually have a former church in my neighborhood that was used as a was previously used as a recording studio because the acoustics are so well done. These are creative ways to do that. This Methodist church would also apply for preservation tax credits, assuming it was restored appropriately. And so I think that's a real story that needs to be told too, is how you help community members navigate those processes. So with that, that's really the conclusion of my presentation. I just really wanted to give everyone kind of a snapshot into kind of how we're thinking about historic preservation in the historic Campbelton area, how we're thinking about really being sensitive to any future growth that honors the history of the area. And, I know that you all are a new commission and happy to answer questions about that overall too, just as someone who has serves like you do on a commission of my own. So at this point, I'm happy to answer questions, Marissa, and go from there. I saw there were maybe a couple chats, and hopefully maybe some of those have been answered by now. And so, yeah, I think Zach mentioned that.
Okay, so
Andrew, thank you very much for the presentation, and I know y'all put a lot of work into this so far. For those members who have not had a chance, if you can go out on planning@pond.com, they have a more in-depth presentation, of which this was a segment of it, and I appreciate Pond's work on putting this together so far. But as Andrew has mentioned, a majority of the historic features that need to be preserved actually exist within the Chat Hills section of the Campbelton Crossroads development area. But we do have an opportunity that on our side, in that we have families that have been long associated with the Campbelton area that live actually in South Fulton, that we may be able to reach out to obtain some of these oral histories. And I think that was a great point, Andrew, in that we need that background to help us understand what Campbelton is all about. And in that line, I think that's one of the things that maybe we can move towards. We'll work with Marissa and the city about setting up some of those oral histories. But thanks again for this presentation. Let me yield to the questions.
Sure. And I will just say about your comments about the oral histories. There are opportunities through like the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities to pursue grant funding opportunities, whether through nonprofits or municipal governments, to actually secure funding for things like oral histories. The Atlanta Beltline is actually doing a similar process focused on their communities along the Beltline to actually capture oral histories. So there are programs in place that you can replicate, and you're not having to start from scratch. So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, thank you. It's something that we need to do to get our arms around the history of this area. And matter of fact, we probably need to do that for the entire South Fulton community.
Hello, this is Sybil Talley. I have a question for Andrew or anyone on the call. Thank you again for the presentation. I know that the Methodist Church is no longer in operation, but it seems like they would have a wealth of records that could be useful in documenting history of the area. My question is, with the church no longer in operation, how does one access those records?
Yeah, so there is, I'm not sure how the agreement worked with the Methodist Church and the owner who purchased the property, because from what I understand from Mike Morton, who's the community development director of Chattahoochee Hills, who has a relationship with the former owners, he told me they are still managing and maintaining the cemetery, which tells me there's still an active group of individuals, a small group, who have those records. So it kind of goes along with the oral history approach. Is number one, it would be good to identify first a repository for records. And I'll give you some examples of those in a second. And second, to make a connection between and Mike Morton has the contact information for those individuals who formerly own the church, and make sure those are saved and recorded somewhere. Two repositories that have been we have a lot of research about this area is the Douglas County Historical Society and the museum, because it formerly part of Douglas County was part of Campbell County. So by nature, they have records about this area as well as the Campbell County Historical Society. They have recently moved to Tyrone, the depot in Tyrone. As I understand it, either Fulton County or the city of Fairburn own the Campbell County Courthouse. I thought it was Fulton County. I don't think it is. I was told different. But their lease was up, and they want a different and better use for that property, so that the records and all the information about Campbellton that was part of that historical society has been moved to Tyrone right now in a much smaller space. I think long term, there is a threat to some of those records because they do not have a permanent home. And so there's only a couple individuals who really run the historical society there. They're very good, dedicated folks. I think long term, making sure that they have a permanent home would be a wise, maybe even a strategy as well as part of this, is to add to that here.
Thank you so much.
Andrew, I like your thought about possibility of providing some sort of permanent home for historical records in this area. That's an excellent thought, and maybe that would actually be, we've got to, one of the issues that came up even during the on-site presentation was relative to the draw to this area. Obviously, the recreation is going to be a large part of it, and potentially some recreational facilities there. The biking opportunity, I'm hoping that the new owner has an opportunity to look at that potential for the church, and has been traditionally transitional use to provide some kind of means of possibly a lease to somebody to operate some sort of a biking type venue out of there. That would make a lot of sense.
There's a wealth of opportunity at that property. You have a captive audience literally every weekend in the summer and spring and fall. With very little effort, you could activate that corner. So when I talk about activation, there's the traditional method of let's lease it out for a long-term use. That's very good. There's also the, more of the tactical approach, short-term, as, let's, making that site a really boon and a gateway, whether it's food trucks, whether it's a bike, roving bike shop, whether it's a farmer's market, fruit stand. I mean, there are so many things you could do there to activate that space and generate income instantly and provide real value to the community. I think, and would bring real insight to the community. And, those are then, as those form, they then become avenues for organizations like yours, the Chattahoochee Hills, Historic Commission, Douglas County, to actually be there in person to tell your story and what you're trying to do, and capture more of those people and find out who those people are who have great histories in the area. So it can really be used as an advantage. Yeah.
Well, I agree. Thank you, Andrew. That's, again, as you say, is we need to work with the existing owner of that property. There may be even an opportunity for a permanent home for the historic records at that location.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. We need to, and I will bring that to Mike Morton's attention and copy Allison Duncan and copy you, Storm, on that email, because as an action item coming out of this this presentation.
Thank you. One of the other things, well, let me yield the floor to any other questions that might be. I had some additional comments as we move ahead, but let me yield the floor to some other questions.
Yeah, John Herring here. Great presentation. Have any consideration been given, conversations been had in terms of the property owner and the United Methodist Church in terms of restoring that property or obtaining that property? Any grants available to have this oral historic piece from individuals that may have lived or currently living in the area? Are there any grants to go out and try to query the information from these persons?
I can, let's start with the latter comment about the oral histories. As it relates to the property owner, no, it has not.
Okay.
And I think that's really going to be something that would be a driver from, kind of commissions like yours to really do that. Now, as it comes to the, what I've been told is that the owner of that property really has no plans for that property in the immediate short term. That he simply purchased the property because it was advantageous since he owns adjacent land around it. So there was really not like, he didn't buy it with, as I understand it, a real intent of anything at the time. I'm just going to buy it, hold on to it. So with that being said, I do not believe there have been any conversations with him about that. I could ask Mr. Mike about that. Mike knows him the best. We've certainly brought up to him and his representatives that there are tax credits at play here that he could use if he wants to redevelop it appropriately. I will just say, I think historically his developments have been focused on simply kind of traditional gas station developments, and he's not really into the preservation. I'm not to say he couldn't do it, anyone can, but his background is not in that world per se. So he may be holding it and selling it later on. He may be holding it to redevelop it. But right now, as I understand, he has no immediate plans. And obviously the cemetery is really, I think the way the agreement worked, as I understand it, that the Methodist Church still, I don't know if they own it or owns and operates it. I'm not sure how they're creating that agreement, if they separate the parcels out or what, but really that would remain intact. So great question. Thank you, Dr. Herring.
Thank you.
Doctor, let's talk offline in a bit about the potential of maybe some tax incentives we may be able to discuss with the new owner for maybe a long-term lease. That we might be able to find an entity that wants to be involved in developing that property into something of a recreational nature that would help preserve the church building itself and protect the cemetery.
And I'm copying a link into the, for people to read more. You may know about this already, this program. So I have a link that I just put in the chat. If anyone wants to read about the kind of an overview of the tax program, it all has to follow Secretary of Interior standards, which are national standards set aside for preservation, and it has to go through the State Historic Preservation Review for those tax credits. But it's a very pretty worthwhile credit program. It also freezes assets. You can also freeze assets as well, tax assessments for 8 years, which is a big deal. If people come in here and begin, if this owner, if we know development's coming down the way, keeping your taxes lower is a great way to do that. So, by preserving it. So.
Thanks, Andrew. That's most helpful. As we move ahead, Andrew, I know you have a pretty healthy task in front of you, and a lot of it has to do with what is appropriate and how to evolve into developing this area. As you've mentioned, the Chat Hills area is moving forward with the recreational facilities. And matter of fact, I think the initial boat dock is coming online here in the next week or two, is it not?
That's correct. It's coming in very soon. I think middle or end of August.
And as we develop that area, I think Councilwoman Rao from District 1 was most impressed with the rural nature of that area. And she said it would be a shame to lose the rural character.
Right.
I think that we need to maybe take a step back and look at the possibility of how do we evolve this area into the development that you're looking at, concerning especially the fact that we don't have the infrastructure there now to support some of the development that we're looking at. And the fact that we don't have, as you mentioned in one of your other presentations, the sanitary facilities. We really didn't talk about the water service. City of Atlanta is responsible for that, and we're already seeing some degradation in our water service in the Cliftondale area because of the new development and the lack of upgrades over the past many years, as well as the transportation. We all know that we have difficulties in that area, especially during peak hour pre-COVID. Right now it's almost tolerable, but it gets out to a level of service probably in pushing at least a D in sometimes, and it won't be long before it goes to F. So it's until you actually sit in the traffic, you really don't appreciate the problems that we're having down there.
No, understood. I'd say a couple things to that. So if I put my preservation hat on for a second, when you talk about managing that well, what I would say is that two things that help control change there short term are the lack of a pump station, which is tied to the sanitary sewer system. It's a small, it's not a huge area, it's not a huge facility, but that would create the need for a force main to pump, force main back up to the Camp Creek sewer facility. So that's a thing. That's something that Fulton County is actively looking at, and they're looking at a 10-year planning horizon to install that type of sanitary sewer system in and around historic Campbelton to provide sanitary sewer to that area. Again, 10-year horizon, take that for what it's worth. It could be as much as 10 years out. That would generate development there. The other thing that I think precludes some development happening is the fact of the transportation concerns, because people don't want to be around, don't want to have the hassle with the transportation. It doesn't lend itself to development, a good development in and around the intersection there on those two major roads, and you have a limited infrastructure network. So if you put my preservation hat on, those two elements really help, can help control change in the short term, for lack of a better word. Long term, I will tell you that there are some property owners who are maintaining ownership and want to live there. We've also had conversations with a lot of development owners who are looking to sell. You talk to anyone, they all have different opinions about that, different perspectives on that, or what their horizon and their timeline. But clearly, and these are anecdotal conversations I've heard from property owners in the area that, they've been approached by different developers and concessionaires to purchase their land. So I think, within 10 years and beyond, this area will be developed. And so there's a fine line that we are trying to find a way to do this, is to straddle to say, if this develops and you want that kind of historic feel to retain that historic rural feel, that's not wrong. That's important to do. But we also want to make sure, we have to remember too, historic Campbelton was a community at one time. So, there were goods and services provided there 150 years ago. And if we want at least some type of good quality development, even if it's very small, we want to make sure we have some standards and controls on that, which is why we're thinking about zoning and things like that. The reality, all this is private property. So whatever vision that is developed in the master plan is really just that, a vision. It has some recommendations on how you control that real character and nature. But at the end of the day, zoning plays a big role in thinking about how you manage and maintain that real character. But if I owned a piece of private property that I could develop it on my own right now, and not change things. And so it's all private property ownership. So it's really just, as I mentioned, it's a vision. So whatever we can do to kind of promote the history, promote good development, promote good zoning, so you can manage change well is really the best, I think, one of the better approaches. And then finding good, people do want to develop, we talked about the Methodist Church, finding good partners there who want to buy that land, who want to preserve those areas, and working with the respective communities, that's the real win. Finding those people who want to participate in that process. So, and that's one of the strategies long term as we think about economic development, how that's done well.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Actually, as I'm seeing you moving ahead with this, it may be to set up the guidelines as you are doing, setting up the guidelines on how this area should be developed. I noticed your, as you said, bubble presentations that you had before. I think probably, I guess, from my engineering perspective, will be to lay out some sort of a road network, an appropriate road network that would help the capacity problems we're having right now at that intersection by moving the intersections away from the roundabout and then being able to develop in the two quadrants. I think it will be more on the east side of 154. That might be a good way to move ahead, possibly with some sort of an Avalon type, not Avalon, but maybe a avenues type development on both those quadrants, and then hopefully move the residential back away from that.
Yep. Well, certainly it lends itself to that too, because of east of Cascade Palmetto Highway, that's the area that has, quote, less restrictions and is more suitable for development. And that's really defined by both the restrictions from the MRPA, as well as slopes, floodplains, those things that can prevent development, so those are certainly better areas to do that. And also preserves the area around the Campbelton Crossroads community. And certainly kind of moving, and as you move down, I'd say towards Hampton Oaks, towards Les Jardins, that area, what we've heard a lot from owners, and again, it's all private property now, a lot of it's undeveloped. Those areas being more of those, as you mentioned, rural, largely, kind of what we're hearing, what we're thinking is more, I say, rural residential, larger tracts of land, maybe little farmettes, which are 6 to 10 acres or more. That really maintains view sheds and maintains that character and limits challenges of transportation and helps with capacity. So for those on the call too, Storm mentioned a roundabout. And one of the things we're investigating that we've been presenting to folks is the idea of a potential roundabout at the intersection of Cascade Palmetto and Campbelton Fairburn Road, which would address congestion and really address even more than that safety concerns, because there's a lot of accidents in that area, and also address speed concerns. It's 50 miles an hour through there. I mean, it doesn't slow down when you hit the intersection. It's 50 miles through the entire area. There is a similar roundabout on the Douglas County side. So by introducing another roundabout, it creates familiarity with the drivers and people in that area. And then that's one method. And then you can begin looking at all sorts of ways to control traffic and make it safer for people to drive through there. But Storm, your points are well taken. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I'm also envisioning the fact that we might lean towards a more walkable community in the Chat Hills area with some remote parking to allow people actually to have a more of a walking community or experience on the Chat Hills side. That may not be what they're looking at, but I'm thinking of kind of like a Woodstock Road in downtown, or not really downtown Roswell, but in their amenity area that they have in Roswell, and make it more of a kind of a walking area for shops and restaurants and all.
Yeah, you make a good point. You know, part of the traffic congestion issue is it results in traffic too. This area will become more popular, especially from a tourist and recreation standpoint. And so we want to find ways to kind of manage that well. So walkability is a big one. From the South Fulton side, we think it's a real opportunity as well. If you're living east of here in Campbelton, Fairburn, we want to make sure, or at least think about long term, that you don't have to just get in your car and have to drive to historic Campbelton if you live a mile away. You know, you have trail networks to connect you, sidewalks to connect you. And right now, the traditional pattern has always been, and this is traditional throughout kind of rural and suburban areas, is if you develop a subdivision, you will build that sidewalk to the subdivision's boundary and then you stop. But that doesn't really create real connectivity. So you really want to begin thinking about how can we expand that. And then also getting across that barrier that is Cascade Public Highway, so people on the South Fulton side can easily access it and don't have to drive there, as well as, you know, making it safe to walk around so you're not having to get and drive. And so this area is not a huge area. The 5-minute walk shed and the 10-minute walk area it captures most of the project area. So it's very walkable. It's just a matter of making those connections easy and safe.
Well, I agree with you that in kind of expanding what you're thinking there, maybe a recommendation might be consideration of grade separated pedestrian walkways, or even golf cart paths as they have in Peachtree City, whether it be through bridges, or very effectively, we may have some grade separation where we can do tunnels there. Of course, this would have to be negotiated with DOT, but they would love to be able to avoid the pedestrian vehicular conflict.
Absolutely. No, you make it's right in line, and it goes back to the story about we talked about the impediment to development here is some of those transportation concerns, and it will cause long-term issues with bicyclists who come there, and recreation tourism, all those different visitors. You're going to need a plan. And we've talked about the planning, even parking as a remote parking as an issue there, right, locally to walk. But think about now if people visit like Cochrane Mill Park, it's packed every weeknight. This parking lot here at the Methodist Church is packed every weekend for bicyclists. So what type of management system could there be in place that actually has remote parking options and even a small transit, short-term vehicle to move people around? We certainly know, we've spoken to Delroy Walters, and he's had some great ideas about other locations for bicyclists and visitors. So I think there's some real opportunity there with a school nearby and other places to create that network of people to remote park and be safe and move around. But it's definitely going to be a network approach.
Well, again, we appreciate this. We might even explore utilization of some pervious paving in some of the floodplain area, as we're allowed to with the river corridor, to possibly utilize some of that area for parking.
Yep, makes total sense. Yep, there's certainly going to be some on-site parking at the Campbelton Park that the DNR is going to build, and there's potential for more in other areas around. Good point.
Again, I don't mean to be taking all the time, but we need to yield the floor to any other questions. And again, if I don't get to an opportunity to speak again, thanks again, Andrew, and Aubrey, for your work on this. And we appreciate you getting involved in this, and look forward to working with you as we move ahead.
If there's no other comments, I just want to say in closing, thank you all for your time and to volunteer. As someone who does it again, I really appreciate you all doing that and taking the time to do that. That means a lot. Means a lot to preservationists around the state. So thank you for doing that.
Thanks again. Marissa, do you have anything else we need to catch up on?
Not that I know of right now. I have a few notes for our next agenda in September. So when we get closer to that, I will send out a draft agenda to you guys, but not anything right now. If you guys have anything else later, you know where to find me.
Marissa, thanks again for all your time and your help. And any comments from the other members of the commission?
None for me.
I have none.
No questions or comments at this time.
None at this time.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for taking your time out this afternoon to look at this. I will call your attention to a Zoom meeting that's being held this evening by our state representatives to discuss the changes that will go in effect today regarding our charter. This is some modifications were made to our charter and how we will be governed. A lot of people were caught blindsided by this, and the state representatives are going to do a presentation this evening. If you have time at 6 o'clock to sit in on that, to discuss what changes are being made to our charter. And this will affect us. So if you care to sit in and hear it firsthand, I don't have the link handy, but I'm sure Marissa possibly could send that out to everybody. If you have it handy, Marissa.
Yeah, I can work on that. I was unaware of the meeting, but I can find the link, and once I have it, I'll email it to y'all.
All right. Again, this is something that we did not anticipate until year of our existence. And I think a group jumped the gun to go ahead and put some changes in place now. So please sit in on that if you have a chance. Anybody have anything else for the good of the committee? I'm happy to entertain a motion to adjourn.
I motion to adjourn this meeting.
I second.
Thank you very much, everyone, for taking your time this afternoon. Thanks again, Andrew and Aubrey, for your time in making this possible.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Likewise.